All right, greetings everyone. We at Franciscan Missionaries of Our Lady University, in the wake of St. Francis's feast day, are celebrating our Franciscan week. And towards the end of this week, we're happy to bring to you our bioethics lecture series. I'd like to begin with a prayer, and I think it's fitting that we would use a prayer of St. Francis's. So as we begin, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. You are holy, Lord, the only God, and your deeds are wonderful. You are strong, you are great. You are the Most High. You are Almighty. You, Holy Father, are King of heaven and earth. You are three in one, Lord God, all good. You are good, all good, the supreme good. Lord God, living and true. You are love, you are wisdom, you are humility, you are endurance, you are rest. You are peace. You are joy and gladness, you are justice and moderation. You are all our riches and you suffice for us. You are beauty, you are gentleness. You are our protector, our guardian and defender. You are courage. You are our haven and our hope, our faith, our great consolation. You are our eternal life, great and wonderful Lord, God Almighty, wonderful Savior. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Brian Pedraza, and I'm an associate professor of theology here at FranU. And on behalf of Dr. Redfield and Mrs. Carol Ann Bryan, who are sponsoring this lecture, and on behalf of my theology colleagues, I want to welcome you to our fall bioethics lecture series. This lecture series was founded by a dear friend and former colleague, Dr. John Meinert, who wanted to take seriously the opportunity for our university, which specializes in the health sciences, to integrate a Catholic Christian moral formation into the training of medical professionals. And so in this light, and under the leadership of Dr. Valerie Schluter, the university is implementing an initiative that we are calling REACH into several of our programs. That's reflecting on ethics and Catholic healthcare. It's our hope that a FranU graduate would be exceptional, not only in the practical skills necessary to be a health professional, but also in the integral human formation needed to discern truth, goodness, and beauty from their counterfeits. Before introducing our distinguished speaker, I'd like to first thank Dr. Schluter and Ms. Tammy Vidrine for their help in organizing and thinking through the event. A word of thanks also goes to Shelley Frederick and Rosie Kuiper and everyone at Our Lady of the Lake Hospital's continuing ed departments. By their efforts, those of you who are physicians and nurses can earn CMEs or CEUs by attending tonight or tomorrow morning's lectures. At the end of the lecture and before the Q&A, I'll post a link to a very short survey, something that could be accomplished in the neighborhood of 2 to 5 minutes. And those seeking continuing ed credits just need to attend the lecture and then fill out the survey, and a certificate will be emailed to you. But we'd also like to stress that it's our hope that everyone attending tonight would fill out the survey. To carry out the work of integrating ethics into our programs, we need the data to tell us how we're doing. And so when I post the link later, I just ask that you please consider taking a few minutes to fill out the survey. It's easiest if it's done immediately, but we'll also make it available for 1 week. Since I mentioned the Q&A, just a quick note. Near the bottom of your screen, there should be an icon for Q&A. And if you have a question, feel free to type it there. You can do this at any point during the lecture. And then at the end, during our Q&A time, I will collate those questions and present them to our speaker as best as I can. And then finally, neither FranU nor our speaker has any conflict of interest to declare in relation to this event. All right, now on with the show. Considering our university's goals, it's only fitting that we continue to host this lecture series, which has featured some of the best and brightest in theological, philosophical, and medical ethics. And tonight is no exception. We are thrilled to have with us Dr. Charles Camosy from Fordham. Dr. Camosy is well published, not only in scholarly journals, but also in such venues as the New York Times, Washington Post, and LA Times. His regular Purple Catholicism column for the Religious News Service is tellingly titled, since he often seeks to overcome the political divides between conservatives and progressives. His 2019 book, Resisting Throwaway Culture, won first place from the Catholic Publishers Association as Resource of the Year. And his newest book, Losing Our Dignity, How Secularized Medicine is Undermining Fundamental Human Equality, will form the backdrop for his comments tomorrow morning, for those of you who will be able to join us then. And so without further ado, I present to you Dr. Charles Camosy, who will be speaking on Resisting Throwaway Culture, Can Pope Francis's Vision Unite a Fractured People?
Thank you, Brian. And good to be with all of you. I'd like to thank John Meinert, actually, who was the original person who invited me, or even before the COVID-19 pandemic started. And I'm just really grateful to be a part of this. I'm really sorry that I can't be there in person, frankly. I was thinking as I was putting together my remarks, when was the last time, if ever, that I had been to Baton Rouge? And I think it was about 23 years ago, actually. I was a graduate student doing some recruitment for the graduate school at Notre Dame, I guess, as a master's student, trying to earn some extra bucks. And two things stuck out to me as remembrances from that trip. The first is that, this is kind of random, but in my hotel, or in the hotel parking lot, as I walked to it, I saw signs that read "Parking for Ladies Only." And as a Wisconsinite living in Indiana, I just was totally struck by this idea. And I guess we won't have a lot of time for back and forth, but I really hope that hasn't gone away. I still hope there's parking for ladies only in that Hampton Inn or wherever I was. And then the second thing I took away was that jambalaya has been ruined for the rest of my life. I just can't, any place I have it elsewhere, it just doesn't possibly compare. So multiple reasons why I'm very sorry I can't be with you in person. But I hope I can offer some remarks this evening that you'll find not only substantial, but provocative. I hope that I'll be provocative enough for you to answer or to ask some questions in the Q&A. So that part of this, selfishly, that's what I look forward to the most. So please don't hesitate to ask even extremely critical questions and make critical comments that are at least, geared towards, charity and exchange. If you disagree with me, I really want to hear from you, especially. So let's leave time for that for sure. Let's start with our current cultural moment. What can we say about our current cultural moment? Well, I don't think it's too dramatic to say that the US American political culture, at least as we come to know it over the past 2 generations, is collapsing. Congress, more polarized than any time since the Civil War, has an approval rating of 19%. Notably, the electorate prefers cockroaches to Congress. It's true, you can look it up. Donald Trump was elected to the presidency in 2016 with a solid electoral college victory, but lost the popular vote by more than 3 million and came in with the lowest approval rating in modern history. The current president has a approval rating which is also tanked in recent weeks. It's well under 40% now from the latest numbers I've seen. Significantly, relatively few voters actually vote for, especially for president, for a candidate they support. Most often they're voting against a terrible candidate that they hate. But this is not just a problem for the presidency, of course. For some time now, the general consensus has been that the Supreme Court, at least on major cultural issues, has abandoned its role as a nonpartisan interpreter of the law in favor of, well, frankly, political warfare, poorly disguised with post hoc legal arguments meant to win the war. The general consensus could not have been more strongly confirmed by the circus that was the 2018 Senate confirmation hearings for Justice Brett Kavanaugh, and soon after, Justice Amy Coney Barrett. Indeed, after those hearings, Elizabeth Bruenig had good reason to wonder whether our political culture is suffering from a near complete dissolution of the trust required for the democratic republic to function at all. There's a deep growing sense, don't you think, that the whole public thing is just little more than a rigged game, rigged by just a tiny few people with power and privilege. who are extremely skilled at disconnecting it from justice or the common good in favor of their own narrow sets of interests and those of their paymasters. The polarization and disconnect of our national politics, I believe anyway, has a symbiotic relationship with the polarization and disconnect within their broader culture. So it's not just in DC or the I-95 corridor. Living in a world dominated by technology like smartphones and social media, many of us find ourselves increasingly disconnected from the physical, the embodied, the real, from anything that could remotely be called an authentic encounter, especially with the other, right? You couple this with the unprecedented ease of travel and mobility, at least in a non-pandemic context, right? We know that most people with the resources to do so basically live in actual and virtual communities that think pretty much like they do. The channels they watch, the books they read, the people they follow on social media, their physical neighbors, their actual and virtual friends, their churches, and people with whom they socialize. We just consume information and engage ideas in comfortable places, ideologically comfortable places, just disconnected from communities that force us or would maybe force us to, critically examine the received wisdom of our ideological communities. So that's not good, and maybe not hopeful, at least given what I just said, limited to what I just said. But here's the thesis for my lecture this evening, and mercifully, there will not be any slides to show you, although tomorrow's lecture will be very much filled with slides. My thesis is that a Roman Catholic critique of our consumerist throwaway culture, one which stands strong within a consistent life ethic offered by St. John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Pope Francis, especially Pope Francis, has the capacity to unite this fractured people, the kind of people that I just described, and to pull us back from the brink we are approaching. And very much in a related story, this opening, I believe, provides a chance for the growing edge of the pro-life movement to take the lead, a growing edge that I think we should call the 3.0 version of the pro-life movement, pro-life 3.0. But what is throwaway culture? What is this thing we ought to be resisting? My initial training as an academic and first love, I actually did a year of doctoral work in this before I abandoned it, but was actually analytic philosophy. And so my first instinct when I have a question, like what is throwaway culture? I want to give you a definition of it, right? But I'm slowly weaning myself off these initial reactions I have and try to do something which I've, over the years as a teacher especially, I've realized are more effective. And that's to begin instead by giving you some examples. And by way of the first example, I'm going to offer you a phrase. See if you've ever heard this phrase before. Think about whether you've ever heard this phrase before. Cardiac pole vibration. Have you heard of that before? Ever hear cardiac pole vibration? Well, it comes out of the debate over recent bills in several states, I think including Louisiana has a nice heartbeat bill that bans abortion in the first trimester of pregnancy. And it's actually referred to by many of the opponents of these bills as so-called heartbeat bills. Maybe you're aware of the debate currently going on, surely you are, in neighboring Texas over their heartbeat bill, which I believe a federal judge just smashed down either earlier today or yesterday. Throughout much of this debate, actress Alyssa Milano, who for some reason has become a significant voice on these and other matters, insisted that the media should not refer to a heartbeat, but instead to use another similarly awkward phrase, fetal pole cardiac activity. So we've got cardiac pole vibration and fetal pole cardiac activity. Now you might just dismiss Alyssa Milano as someone who doesn't know anything about prenatal biology, but she actually got the phrase from an OBGYN named Jennifer Gunter, whose description was picked up by all sorts of folks, national media, general folks online, including Alyssa Milano. The science correspondent for Slate magazine, who interviewed Dr. Gunter, referred to it as, quote, a cluster of pulsating cells. So we got cardiac pole vibration, we got fetal pole cardiac activity, we got a cluster of pulsating cells. Dr. Jennifer Kearns, an OBGYN at UC San Francisco, called it a group of cells with electrical activity. Yeah, I could go on here, but you probably get the idea. These and other authorities in medicine seem quite naturally to offer a definitive refutation of a manipulative term like heartbeat when we talk about banning abortion after the baby's heartbeat can be detected. But as a bioethicist and healthcare ethicist, I know quite well just how deeply political, and especially political with regard to abortion politics, how politics has infected even the most basic discussions in medicine and biology. So there is no sort of siphoned off place where people are doing pure medicine and biology, especially on these sets of issues. In point of fact, the primordial heart is a group of cells in the same sense you and I are groups of cells. Open any embryology textbook and they will tell you that at 6 weeks gestation, the human fetal heart has 4 chambers and is pumping blood unidirectionally. 4 chambers pumping blood unidirectionally. These very same experts, in fact, apart from the debate over abortion heartbeat bills, will tell pregnant women at 6 or 7 weeks that their baby's heartbeat is so many beats per minute, and make sure the parents can listen to that heartbeat. And indeed, as many of you know who have been close to a pregnancy at this time, and I was about 4 years ago, the heartbeat is an incredibly important marker for the health of the prenatal child at this stage of her life. In fact, if there's something amiss with the heartbeat, that's very, very important to figure out what's going on there, because that baby could be at risk of dying. So apart from the abortion political debate, we're very comfortable talking about how many beats per minute and talking about the development of a heart. These kind of rhetorical moves in the debate over heartbeat bills and abortion is a classic example of what Pope Francis calls throwaway culture, where even human beings are reduced to mere things that could be discarded as so much trash. An important part of the dehumanization, which often takes place, in fact, I would say most often takes place, is with using specific words and phrases for the unwanted, for the inconvenient, which makes them easier to discard. Again, the website Secular Pro-Life, you don't need to be religious to have this point of view, has been at pains to say, the fetal heart is a bunch of pulsating cells because the early fetus herself is a bunch of pulsating cells. But they also point out that the early fetus herself is often described as just a bunch of cells anyway, in a similarly dismissive way, right? Like just a cluster of cells, right? That you can therefore dismiss without ever really, and discard without ever really thinking about the fact that we have a fellow member of the human family there. Now, I would actually take it a step further. I don't know what you think about this, but maybe we could talk about this in question and answer and say, even using the term fetus rather than baby is a classic dehumanization tactic, right? I mean, when the child is wanted, we talk about baby bumps, baby showers. Your OBGYN tells you your baby is doing great, right? But when the topic is abortion, suddenly when the prenatal child is unwanted, we shift our language, right? We talk about the fetus or the products of conception, or with some activists, even a parasite. Yeah, so it's, you'll even have folks like Dr. Gunter tweet out things like, a fetus is not a baby, a fetus is not an unborn or preborn baby or child. If your goal is to legislate medical care, you have to use medical terminology. I will call you out. She's a different word, but I will call you out each and every time. This is actually NPR's official guidance, believe it or not. NPR's official guidance is, quote, says to avoid language suggesting, quote, that there is a baby inside a pregnant woman, not a fetus. Babies are not babies until they are born. There are fetuses. Incorrectly calling a fetus a baby or the unborn is part of a strategy used by anti-abortion groups, end quote. Well, it's only a strategy in an abortion context. Otherwise, again, when the baby's wanted, we have no problem, of course, using the term baby. And this is despite the fact that we now know so much about prenatal biology in ways that are just astonishing, that make the kind of dehumanization tactics this way seem absolutely absurd, like biologically absurd. In fact, my friend Dr. Kristen Collier at the University of Michigan Medical School has demonstrated quite powerfully in her recent lectures and in her writing about even how the mother and prenatal child cooperate with each other in pregnancy in deep and profound and moving ways. And I don't have time really to get into all of her work on this, but I really recommend it for learning more about the just astonishing things we now know about prenatal biology and the relationship of the prenatal child with her mother. Furthermore, dozens, I don't need to tell a lot of people on this call, dozens of medical institutions from the Mayo Clinic to the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia refer to prenatal surgery as being done on unborn babies. So it's just not true that this is a term used by pro-lifers. It's the other way around, actually. We changed the language to make the prenatal child easier to discard. Let me move on from this. So obviously abortion, and our Holy Father has really talked about how abortion is a classic example of throwaway culture, but I wrote a book that was on a consistent life ethic, and there's many, many more examples of throwaway culture that we ought to talk about. We can talk about throwaway culture and assisted suicide, for instance. I would argue that the West's slouch towards assisted suicide is also a classic example of discarding a vulnerable population. We might have some sympathy actually for, and we should, of course, have sympathy for those who are facing a very painful death or just pain in general, of course. But did you know that in Oregon, which has had assisted suicide the longest in the United States since the 90s, physical pain doesn't even make the top 5 reasons that people request physician-assisted suicide in that state? The #1 fear is loss of autonomy. Also high on the list is being a burden on other people. Perhaps my favorite article that I've ever written or read in bioethics was written in First Things by Gilbert Meilander, which was titled, "I Want to Burden My Loved Ones." For my kids, they would probably say something like, "Don't worry, Dad, you got that covered." But it's important, right, to think about what we're saying when we say, if loss of autonomy is the #1 reason, if fear of being a burden on others is one of the main reasons, what are we saying? Social justice activists already know in other areas how disabled, non-autonomous, burdensome human beings are unfairly treated and marginalized by an ableist culture. But for some reason, on the issue of physician-assisted suicide, we're content to use that language and logic of throwaway culture to say, you know what? If you're not autonomous and you feel like you're a burden on others, we can kind of understand why you'd want to kill yourself, and let's make room for you to be able to do that. There's a reason, a very important reason, why disability rights groups are almost universally against physician-assisted suicide. It's because of its contribution to throwaway culture, and specifically throwing away disabled human beings. So rather than working to create a culture in which autonomy and independence are not prerequisites for mattering, which is how we should dismantle ableism, of course, instead of trying to, share and even celebrate our fellow burdens the way we burden each other, quote unquote, mutually burden each other, we instead diabolically work to make it easier for these people to kill themselves, these marginalized people to kill themselves. That is throwaway culture. Now, I've talked about abortion and physician-assisted suicide. You might think, well, that sounds like quote unquote issues of the right, or conservative issues. But as Brian mentioned in his introduction of me, I'm not at all a conservative. I'm not at all a liberal. I'm certainly a purple or magenta Catholic, where I try to think about not in terms of red or blue, not in terms of right or left, but just trying to follow my principles, which largely come from the moral theology and teaching of the Catholic Church. I just try to follow them consistently, and they end up, wherever they end up. Certainly not. I don't to think at all in terms of on the left or the right. But if we have to use the categories, I guess, you might think of the first two sets of issues I looked at as on the right. But if we have to use these topics, these categories, I want to make sure to hit some issues from the left. So, and in fact, if you just read St. John Paul II's Evangelium Vitae, you don't even need to read Pope Francis on this. His Pope John Paul II's great encyclical on the gospel of life, you see that Catholic teaching applies our principles on many, many sets of issues, including issues well beyond abortion and assisted suicide. And historically, many injustices, I believe anyway, and I think I can back this up, have taken place primarily because we are beholden to a particular ideology which makes certain human beings invisible to us, especially when their dignity is most inconvenient. But by following our principles consistently across a range of issues in a consistent life ethic, we can help mitigate against this kind of idolatry of secular leftism or secular conservatism, and instead think about applying our first principles consistently without worrying about those things. So in resisting throwaway culture, I'm at pains to dismantle throwaway culture wherever I find it. I invite / challenge you to do the same, regardless of the ideological category secular politics offers us to work with. I mean, one way to think about this, one way to dive into this, across the political aisle move is to ask you to think about the Me Too movement. People with a kind of politics which leads them to miss the throwaway culture in abortion and euthanasia, I think, can see quite clearly how our sexual culture turns people into things to be used and misguided, often with explicit violence, the kind of explicit violence that #MeToo was attempting to highlight and challenge. And how about homelessness and mental health more generally? We can see the result of throwaway culture in this regard. In most of our major and medium-sized cities, there's even homelessness in rural communities that doesn't get talked about a lot. Many of these homeless are veterans, people we sent to war to experience and perpetuate all kinds of terrible things, but their dignity is now quite inconvenient for us, especially if they're mentally ill and they are just kind of discarded on our streets like trash. That's a classic consequence of throwaway culture. Happily, I think anyway, over the last few years, both left and right are beginning to see how the throwaway culture functions when it comes to mass incarceration in the United States. We bear, of course, a totally humiliating record as having the highest such rate in the entire world. Instead of trying to focus on the root causes of crime, especially drug addiction and mental illness, we are often simply happy just to throw human beings away in our jails and prisons at ridiculously high rates, and even in some cases to add insult to injury, profit off of their slave labor in prison and outside of prison. We're also happy to discard migrants claiming asylum from deadly violence, especially in the Northern Triangle, dehumanizing them by naming them merely illegals or some such phrase produced by throwaway culture also to hide their dignity. We've even been willing to separate children from their families, using the anguish of children as a kind of deterrence to the kind of immigration we don't want to have. Can you imagine using a child's anguish in this way? We have been willing to separate children in a way that is totally reminiscent and frankly a paradigmatic example of throwaway culture, using this vulnerable population as a means to an end rather than seeing her as an end in herself, turning a person into a thing. A classic example of how throwaway culture works. I also think we need, frankly, to examine how throwaway culture functions when it comes to the non-human world. Throwaway culture is very important when we think about the root causes of climate change, of course, as we discard our trash and carbon emissions, often without a second thought for what this means for our common home and for future generations and their common home. How we treat, I believe, non-human animals is also part of throwaway culture as well. Notice how we use one set of words and phrases for animals when they're wanted as our pets, but then another very different set when we want them as our food. My kids get this at our dinner table. I let them choose to eat what they want, but I insist on calling their meals by the name of the animal they're eating. And so I asked my daughter Gina, you know, how is your pig sandwich? Is it tasting very good for you? So at least if they're going to make the choices, they're being intellectually honest with themselves about what's actually going on there. And boy, I mean, isn't it? I mean, it'd be difficult to imagine a more terrible example of throwing away than what we do to animals in factory farms. I probably don't need to tell many of you. You can research it yourself. I wrote a book called For Love of Animals, which goes into some detail on this. Even in the book Resisting Throwaway Culture, I go into it in some level. But let me just leave you with this on this topic, this phrase, because I think it really describes it. Protein units per square foot. That's how the factory farm industry in their literature refers to animals. Protein units per square foot. Animals, I think we should all agree, regardless of what we think about animal dignity and animal protection, animals are not protein units. They are creatures which God created good without any reference to human beings at all. Earlier, I mentioned the growing edge of the pro-life movement. Those of you who are young yourselves on this call, and those of you who teach young people maybe know this already, but young pro-life people today absolutely blow up our culture's stereotypes when it comes to what that term used to mean. In fact, it's probably better, in light of this diversity, to talk about pro-life movements rather than the pro-life movement or something. And among young pro-lifers, especially, something like resisting throwaway culture is already at the center of what they're doing. I'm so happy to see your governor do his resisting throwaway culture thing, his purple pro-life thing, his pro-life Democrat thing, in a way that's just, from my perspective, just exactly where we need to be on these questions. So I'm preaching to the choir maybe in some ways, if you already know that it can exist in your own governor, but hopefully you realize how rare that is around the country. That is a great gift you have in Governor Bell Edwards. I'll also note the Archbishop of Los Angeles, Archbishop Gomez, recently noted that there are no single issue saints. And this also plays well into, I think, the growing edge of the pro-life movement. And even beyond the younger generation that I'm having in mind here, I frankly don't know any single issue pro-lifers. I know some people who really want to focus on abortion, but I don't know anyone that says that human trafficking or physician-assisted suicide, or even, you know, how we think about hookup culture and sexual violence, as if these don't matter somehow or are not issues that they're concerned about. But everyone has, almost no one thinks about every issue exactly the same. There are many parts in one body, right? There's different strokes for different folks. But a multi-issue approach, I would argue, not only is just what most people have, but it actually conserves the origins of the pro-life movement, which began well before Roe versus Wade. As the historian Daniel K. Williams wrote an amazing book called Defenders of the Unborn. I really recommend it to you if you want to learn about the history of the pro-life movement before Roe versus Wade, which is essential to understand it after Roe versus Wade, I think. The pro-life movement of that time was incredibly diverse, very ideologically diverse. In fact, as hard as it may be for us to imagine, for those of us that grew up maybe in the 80s and 90s, large percentage of the pro-life movement before Roe were actually also anti-Vietnam War activists. In fact, they even burned their birth certificates as tools of government oppression at pro-life rallies, in much the same way that they burned their draft cards at anti-war rallies. They saw both documents as kind of a tool for violence, as it were. You could use violence before you had the birth certificate, right? And you could use violence if you were called up to participate in this war. In fact, maybe we should call that movement pro-life 1.0. Pro-life 2.0 happened with the rise of the moral majority, Ronald Reagan, the unification of libertarians, neoconservatives, and religious conservatives in what is sometimes called the three-legged stool. I must admit to finding that coalition a very odd one indeed, especially for pro-lifers who want to reduce abortion in ways that libertarians maybe would find difficult to stomach. But maybe that helps explain why for the first couple decades of pro-life 2.0, we appointed such bad judges and eschewed trying to reduce abortion by lowering the demand for abortion. But pro-life 3.0 is on the way. And not least because the political coalition which formed pro-life 2.0 is in the process of falling apart, like I mentioned in the opening. The political culture which we've known for the last couple of generations is, I think, is it fair to say it has collapsed? And we're just now trying to figure out what will replace it. So the time is totally, totally right for pro-life 3.0. And this approach not only better conserves the history of the pro-life movement, pro-life 1.0, but it's absolutely an essential tool if we're going to be persuasive in the public sphere, I would argue. So many of our fellow US Americans agree so much with what the pro-life movement proposes, even on abortion policy, and yet the very same people cannot see themselves as part of the pro-life movement, especially insofar as they imagine that it's somehow uniquely about abortion. Which our opponents paint incorrectly, but with some success, as being somehow uniquely about controlling women and about misogyny. If you're only focused on abortion from their perspective, what else could that be about? I want to argue that consistently resisting throwaway culture beyond the requirements that we have of faith and reason to do so could put a really diverse pro-life movement, diverse generationally, racially, politically, in a place to be a healing, unifying balm for our hyper-polarized, wounded country and discourse. And now is the moment for something like this, as again, many of our fundamental political assumptions are totally up for grabs. Let me finish my remarks by focusing on consumerism and the fact that national politics cannot fill the holes in our souls. Last semester I was teaching. I'm on research sabbatical this year, so I'm not teaching this academic year. But in the spring semester, I asked my students, I said, the data seems to indicate about 40% of you are suffering from some kind of very serious depression and or anxiety. And my students, and I built rapport with them at this point where they could tell me the truth on this. My students said that 40% number, Professor Camosy, is way too low. It's way, we don't know what the number is, but it's higher than 40%. I think especially as our culture has become more secularized, many of us seem to be looking to find our ultimate concern in national politics. It's become an obsession in many ways. But as Jonah Goldberg pointed out recently, politics, this kind of national politics, cannot fill the holes in our souls. Indeed, a hyper focus on politics and policy keeps us frothy and anxious at a surface level in ways that make it worse, right? They distract us and even prohibit us from the kind of foundational introspection that this cultural moment provides us. We have a moment here to pause and think about what this new thing we could build together might look like. But instead, we're kind of kept frothy and anxious at the surface level. And this is exacerbated, I don't need to tell you, of course, by social media and the smartphone, combined with social media, especially, two institutions now which dominate our lives in ways that are frankly designed to keep us frothy and anxious and to not allow us to kind of be still and sit in the fields and sit before God and listen to God speaking to us. But yeah, I think that's a very important part to think about here as well. If we resist consumerism in this way, if we resist the frothiness, if we resist this kind of way of being in the world, especially when it comes to smartphones and social media, we can resist throwaway culture. And here is the topic I'll finish with what I call and Pope Francis calls a culture of encounter, right? genuine embodied encounter with others. The kind of thing that unfortunately I am not. I realize the irony of my mentioning this as I'm coming to you via Zoom. I really wish we could have an embodied encounter. But the fact that I am missing being with you in person is in itself evidence that something really important is missing in our exchange right now. I mean, the data is already out there. People who manage to avoid this kind of way of being in the world are happier and more fulfilled. But instead, we have a culture that's lonely, desperately lonely, mortally lonely. But Pope Francis calls us to face-to-face encounter with others, face-to-face encounters with their people's physical presence to challenge us, to be confronted with their pain and their pleas, to be confronted with their joy, which infects us, right? I mean, how many people have you known who you just want to be around because their joy is infectious? On some level, our culture knows we need this. God created us to exist in relationship with each other. This is how we flourish. But again, we were lonely and anxious before the pandemic, but my gosh, we're at a whole new level now. And I realize there's a kind of a mix of people on the call this evening, but I wonder if there are any entrepreneurs out there, people thinking creatively, who might be able to respond to our current situation and say, you know what? I have an idea for this. And this is back to what can we do in this moment to kind of respond to it, this new thing we've been given? Because it's not just the collapse of our political culture, it's also the pandemic. It's also an attempt to maybe envision a post-pandemic future where we can do things differently, where we can make a list and have a set of goals about genuine encounter with others and helping others encounter themselves in a genuine way, which resists these kinds of things. And so I'll finish with, frankly, just 3 things that I've been thinking about that might actually help build a culture of encounter with people who could, which again is the antidote to a throwaway culture, right? The more we can build a culture of encounter, the less we will participate in a throwaway culture. So here are just kind of 3 things I've been thinking about. They're somewhat random, and if you have some questions about them, I'd be happy to talk about it. But 1, can we find a way to help facilitate the desire of people to find a way to start dating again? And I'm not talking about swipe right, swipe left nonsense from so-called dating apps, which are really hookup apps that turn people into things. Remember hookup culture, rape culture, all that. But really facilitating genuine encounters between people. And I hope this isn't like an old man get off my lawn type of comment, but in my day, we would just kind of randomly meet people at a bar or, in the grocery store or on the street or in a class or something. And these things never, of course, happened with smartphones because we didn't have smartphones. But I'm enough of I hope, not an old man get off my lawn old man to know that it's maybe not going to be exactly the way it was. But what would it look like? What would a culture of encounter with regard to dating look like? Maybe especially on a college campus. I know this is a lot of commuters on campus. Maybe commuters would like to have more access to things like this. I don't know, but maybe that's just something to think about. I think it would push back on throwaway culture in a major important way on multiple levels. And here, number 2 is a related story. Find a way to help lonely and depressed young people meet via a culture of encounter across generations with older people who are also lonely and depressed. There's this amazing initiative that came from, one reason I thought about maybe mentioning entrepreneurs is because surely an entrepreneur came up with this. There's something called Glenner Town Square, which actually is kind of like a walk-in memory care facility for people suffering from dementia. Maybe not even suffering is not the right word, people with dementia. And it's a 1950s town square with the library and the police station and the diner and You know, the center town square with the sidewalks, with the, you know, the statue and the 1950s cars, right, and all that stuff. And it's just a beautiful example of younger people coming up with this idea, but also younger people working there, right? They're at the police station, they're at the library, they're the waiters and waitresses at the diner, etc. And there's this just beautiful example of a cross-cultural, cross-generational encounter. And right now we have desperately lonely young people and desperately lonely older people, elders in nursing homes especially, and in other care facilities. So how can we do that? How can we facilitate a culture of encounter across generations? I think that would be a super, super interesting and important way to resist throwaway culture by creating a culture of encounter. And finally, there's clearly a moment of creative destruction when it comes to education going on right now. I just saw a statistic that 1 in 12 children are now being homeschooled. It's an astonishing number. When these kids grow up, since the disproportionate number of homeschooled students that go to college, those of us teaching them when they go to college, I hope I still am, we'll probably have about 1 in 10, if these numbers hold up, 1 in 10 will be homeschooled. More and more pods and post-pandemic, or you know, pandemic contemporaneous ideas, you know, involve pods and all sorts of creative ideas. How can we create real communities of encounter in education itself? I'm thinking about this in particular because of the slouch, and again, I realize the irony of my saying this over Zoom, but the slouch towards Zoom and the slouch towards virtual learning. Now, virtual learning is here to stay. It's not going anywhere, but we have to find a way to supplement it in a way, if it's going to be done authentically, that includes genuine encounters. I mean, I'm worried, frankly, that my children, as they go through school, are in part because of their phones and because of the virtual nature of so much of what they're doing, that they're not going to have the kind of deep and long-lasting friendships that I was fortunate enough to create during my time in elementary school. I have 3 or 4 good friends today from elementary school, a few more from high school, long-lasting, deep-lasting friendships because we had a genuine encounter that I think, frankly, is quite different than is often happening. But I'll be happy to be corrected by folks if I'm wrong about that. But I think, regardless of whether I'm right or wrong about that, we especially post-pandemic, and as virtual learning becomes something that we reckon with, especially in a consumer context where we're trying to drive down costs in multiple ways, to build a culture of encounter in education, especially in this moment of creative destruction, I think is super important. So those are 3 kind of random things, but those have been on my mind and heart recently, and I wanted to finish with those. All right, that's a lot, but I'll stop there and say again that the reason I am on the call this evening is to get your thoughts, and I'm anxious to hear what you have to say.
Okay, thanks, Charlie. Really appreciate your comments there. Just a little bit of a reminder here. I will post in the chat the survey link for people to fill out. If you're looking for continuing ed credits, you will need to complete the survey. And we're actually asking everyone who is joining with us this evening, if you could just take the 2 minutes or so to fill it out. It would really help in our efforts to integrate Catholic Christian ethic into our healthcare training. So a couple questions already for you, Charlie. So the first one comes from Deacon Mark Berard in our local community. And he asks, how would you suggest is the best way to move forward? Would you encourage committed pro-lifers who are anti-abortion focused to broaden their focus?
Yes, but a qualified yes. So sometimes, and I know this is not implied by the question, but sometimes the way that really important question is asked implies that somehow a very intense focus on abortion is wrong-headed, or even worse than wrong-headed. And I definitely don't want to say that. So we all have different, roles to play. There's different strokes for different folks. There's many parts, one body. So for those who are more focused on abortion, and I think frankly we should start calling it prenatal justice. That's really what's at stake here. Good, right? We should have a particular intense focus on prenatal justice, given how many lives are at stake, and not just, of course, prenatal lives. The lives of mothers are just. I mean, you can't talk about pregnancy, right? Or you shouldn't talk about pregnancy without talking about two people, right? Pregnancy involves two people. That said, I do think that one only really strengthens one's efficacy efficacy and the message is more efficacious when we can show that we're not just picking on women or something like that. We're just not picking on abortion as a single issue. And so if we're not just, preaching to the choir, if we're not just virtue signaling, if we're actually interested in changing minds and hearts, at least my experience is that you don't water down your message if you expand it to other issues. You actually really ramp up the efficacy of your message. And then let me finish by saying, like, I just don't know any single issue people, frankly. Like, even if we have to use this language, like the far right, their stem cell research and assisted suicide are almost always part of the package. So, I just frankly don't know any single issue pro-lifers out there.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. The questions are rolling in. So once again, if people want to use the Q&A function at the bottom of their screen, that's how you can ask a question. The next one comes from Dr. David Whitten. He is a theologian at the university. He says, you mentioned your childhood relationships and their importance, but that requires staying in a place for a while. How does our mobility contribute to throwaway culture?
Thanks, David. Yeah, thank you for your question. And that's a really important point. And I hinted at it in the beginning when I said we kind of move to places and neighborhoods that are rarely going to challenge our own point of view. That's part of what's going on with our hyper-polarized culture right now. But it's also the case that people move for other reasons. They often move for a job or for whatever, list of things. And I do think there's something to be said for, I really think there's something to be said for staying in place. And I say this as a Wisconsinite who is talking to New Jersey now. And I think about my parents a lot. And I think about that all three of their kids are not with them, and wish that and pray that that at least one of us, if not more than one of us, can be with them as they grow older into their 70s. And so I'm not excusing myself when I say this, but I think a lot of us, frankly, need to think about place and think about family and think about commitment, and think not as much about going out and spreading your wings and going out into the world and living your dreams. Those things are important, but they need to be balanced with unchosen commitments. So our chosen life goals need to be balanced with our unchosen commitments. And one of those, obviously, is to our mother and father, who we don't choose. But it's also maybe to the place in which we came up, to the place in which we were raised. And if we can focus on that, and it's not a rule or something, it's not like an exceptionalist moral norm, but it's maybe something to keep in mind in a way that our culture finds difficult. And David is totally right. If we're going to have those lifelong, deep, profound friendships, they need time.
Great. This next question, I'll say it's sort of a combo question from Lincoln, Tanus, and then also Deacon Berard. They're both thinking in terms of isolation, social media use, things like that. So if during the pandemic, people have experienced a great amount of isolation, and indeed, social media in some sense increases that, not only in the psychological sense, but even in the ideological sense of isolating people because of algorithms choosing what you see and things like that. What are some ways that we can actually help people who have been formed in this sort of culture to sort of, how can we draw them away from the attraction of that sort of a thing?
Well, it's tough, right? Because, and I'm living this, have been living this as a parent of teenagers for some time now, and it's tough. The smartphone and social media are so built into their social expectations, especially if one is in a more traditional school, that it's really difficult to think about how that might work. But here's a story that might help. So when I was, this is really before even social media took off, but when I was in grad school, it was kind of just starting. But when I was in my doctoral work at Notre Dame, I was also an assistant rector in one of the dorms, Morrissey Hall. And Morrissey had kind of a reputation for being a crazy place, and it kind of was, but at least by Notre Dame standards, it wasn't that crazy. But we would have exposition of the Blessed Sacrament once a week in the chapel. And I knew the guys on my floor pretty well, and we would talk and argue, and I would learn that they, what they thought about lots of things, including theology or God or whatever. And I knew a lot of folks were agnostic or didn't believe. And a couple of these guys would show up at Eucharistic adoration who didn't believe in God, much less Roman Catholicism. And I would talk to them afterwards, like, well, what's that about? Why did I see you down there? And again, this is before, Instagram and Snapchat and TikTok kind of took over the world. They're like, Charlie, this is the only time I really get to kind of be quiet and to kind of be with myself. Every other part of my life is so inundated with noise and concerns and anxieties. Like, I just wanted to be in a place where I could just be quiet. And I think that says, I think that need has only increased, maybe even exponentially increased since then. So the more that we can provide spaces like that for our students and for our young people, maybe even for ourselves, the better. It doesn't need to be Eucharistic adoration, though I think that's a good idea. Some of my colleagues in theology offer the chance as part of their theology classes to have a technology fast or a kind of technology Sabbath as a formal part of the class, not just because they think it's good, but because it actually fits with what they're trying to teach theologically. Maybe some people on this call already do that. I think that's good. But I think the more that we can, I refuse to allow my students to use smartphones or laptops when we're in person classes. That's another thing, to try to get them focused on something else. But maybe, then I'll finish with this. Maybe just, again, encouraging the best we can real life embodied personal relationships is also a way to resist it. Those that can't be limited to a text or to a DM or to a FaceTime conversation. Those that you kind of need to go meet them for a drink. You kind of have to get on a plane and go see them. You have to kind of make sure you're in the same pew at church to really do honor to that kind of deep, profound relationship.
Those are wise words. Thanks, Charlie. It challenges me as a professor too to think about ways in which I'm encouraging attentiveness or inattentiveness in my own teaching techniques and things like that.
Well, I'm aware of the fact I'm saying it over Zoom. So
yeah, our next question comes from Father Ajoko, who is a chaplain. He does chaplaincy work over at our local hospital. And it's sort of a purple Catholicism question. He says, what should we do, or how should we address people who put in all that they have to protect the unborn children, but then will vote to eliminate social welfare programs that help take care of the kids once they're born, or perhaps also vote in ways that promote the military outfit and increase in wars and things like that.
Yeah, I find it deeply problematic for reasons that should be clear from my talk. And if you buy my book, Resisting Throwaway Culture, you'll also get even more of a lot of reasons. There's a section on, there's a chapter on, state-sponsored violence. I think it's important to highlight again that that pro-life 1.0 was filled with people who were concerned both about the violence of the Vietnam War and about the violence of abortion. That said, I think there's enough inconsistency to go around here that I wouldn't want to focus just again on those who make abortion their central issue. So a lot of the people who are voting for universal health care and for respecting our common home are not just not interested in prenatal justice, but actively working against prenatal justice. The Democratic Party, the National Democratic Party right now, is basically trying to pass, the House of Representatives did pass the most expansive abortion bill we've ever had in the United States. That we are already the only country, one of 7 countries in the world that allow abortion on demand beyond 20 weeks as our national policy. But if that bill somehow passes the Senate, which please God let it not, we would be like maybe the world's leader in ignoring and being hostile to prenatal justice. So Father is right to point out that there's a deep inconsistency in the way that he pointed it out. But again, the inconsistency is so ubiquitous everywhere that I wouldn't want to focus on one particular kind of inconsistency.
The next question comes from Father Paul Gross. He says, Dr. Camosy, thank you so much for your thoughts. I know I may be opening a can of worms here, but can you speak to the culture of wearing masks, now possibly hindering a culture of encounter? I realize that masks may be for some safety, but is it possible to overdo it and forget about the psychological effects? Could it be possible that showing the face is an important part of encountering someone?
Absolutely. And I think it's especially an important question to ask about young children. I have a 3-year-old who sometimes goes to daycare who it's just a ridiculous thing to try to get him to wear a mask. It's a ridiculous thing to try to do a lot of things, but and his social development is I mean, all the data we have on that really shows that it's important for him to see faces and for others to see his face and see how people react to him. And there seems to be quite a bit of data to show that masks have unclear effects on these very young populations in schools. Plenty of countries in Europe, for instance, have not had mask mandates for their kids in school. When it comes to older folks, I think maybe there's a different set of questions to ask, and there I would just say we need to be attentive to even wearing masks the right way and wearing the right masks. And if you have a beard like mine or wearing a cloth mask, probably a mask isn't going to do that much for you. But if you wear an N95 mask and you wear it properly and you don't overuse it, it can be very effective. And if we're talking about saving lives here, then there's a different set of questions, I think, to ask, especially for older people and that sort of thing. But I do think that even asking the question is brave, frankly, and important. And again, I really loathe the fact that we try to that this issue seems to be again fitting into our right, left, red, blue binary somehow. That somehow if you're a Republican, you're not for masks, or if you're a Democrat or a progressive, you are for masks. Let's just do the best we can with the data and the arguments and try to do the best we can.
Yeah. Yeah, I wonder if sometimes our conversations like this, we have a tendency to fall into the political divide instead of even just arguing or debating or discussing the goods that are at stake. What goods that we're after. It seems to be part of the conversation that is left out when it becomes a political squabble. In the same vein, we've got an anonymous question, and this person says, do you see the church today as one of the isolated communities in our culture? Or do you see it as a safe place to restart the culture of learning and the human experience across generations?
Yeah, I think that would depend on a number of factors, but certainly the church in the United States, maybe even the church in Louisiana, is just so diverse that it depends like what parish you're talking about, what state you're talking about, what part of the country you're talking about. Maybe in the Northeast where I am, there's a kind of indifference plus hostility that makes it very difficult to talk about it being kind of like a home base or something like this, that maybe doesn't exist in Louisiana or Arizona, in places like that where it seems like the church is thriving in a different way or existing in a different way. So maybe it would depend on what context we're talking about here. But overall and in the main, I would say yes, like the church is a place, or is/can be, somewhere between is and can be, a place to launch the kinds of things that I was talking about. In fact, I think it's probably I'll talk about this tomorrow morning. I think the church's participation in healthcare, for instance, is going to be one of the really important places to hold on to a kind of fundamental human equality that secularized medicine has given up on, explicitly given up on. I'll talk tomorrow about this, but we've moved from a vision of equality, which is based on us sharing a common human nature that's made in the image and likeness of God, to equality coming from, whether you actually can express certain traits like autonomy, rationality, self-awareness, productivity. And if we're going to be salt and light in the world in a way that that holds on to that vision of human equality, that holds on to the vision of encounter and embodiedness, that holds on to nonviolence and looking around for who's the most vulnerable first, it's going to come from the church. It's going to come from our churches first, if it's going to come from anywhere at all, it seems to me.
No, I think that's well said, especially since one of the marks of the church is being one, and the unity really comes from Christ himself. I like to say that the seamless garment belongs to someone.
Bingo.
Yeah. I want to be cognizant of the time here, but maybe two more questions. The first one comes also from an anonymous attendee who says, Dr. Camosy, your talk is fascinating on the efforts to redefine medical terms based upon political ideology. And that lends itself to a larger issue that surely I and many of my colleagues here tonight struggle with. There are surely moments in all of our lives when we realize our own use in the context of certain words needs to change, and deservedly so. But it feels like there is an exponential push to evolve language to remove any implication of privilege or exclusiveness, which can result in an extreme level of confusion and divisiveness, and frankly, perhaps creates a barrier to learning and enlightenment. I'm wondering if you have a system to determine how and when you use these triggering terms these days in academic settings, or even how you approach it with your own children as a parent.
So can you maybe help me, Brian, think about what kind of terms this anonymous attendee has in mind here? Because I'm trying to think about it. I'm not quite sure I fully understand.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure as well, but I wonder if, since the person used terms, for instance, like privilege or exclusiveness, I wonder if maybe as part of diversity training, which seems to be getting more and more ubiquitous in different places and in hospital training, university training. I'm wondering if this person is maybe thinking about that, the sort of terms that are used there, and is this in some way clouding our ability to see with a unified vision? That's my best shot.
Yeah, thanks. That's helpful. Well, I guess maybe without speaking about specific terms, I can just say something in general. I think the key is, are the terms being used in an authentic way, right? Like, again, if we're going to use the term fetus, we should use it consistently. We shouldn't just use it when we're talking about abortion or just in a biology class or something, right? Nobody says fetus bump because that would be really weird. It's a baby bump. Also heart, right? If we're going to talk about the baby's heart and heartbeat when the baby's wanted, we should also use it when the baby's unwanted. If we're going to talk about issues of racial justice, if we're going to talk about issues of privilege, if we're going to talk about issues of colonialism, if we're going to talk about issues of hearing from those who are marginalized, then we should do it in every single circumstance, right? Not just when it's politically advantageous, not just when it's politically comfortable for us, not just when we can use it as a weapon to advance some other kind of often political but not only political agenda. So for the same reason, we shouldn't use fetal pull cardiac activity, because what does that even mean? That's just a made up term to attack fetal heartbeat bills in pursuit of prenatal justice. We shouldn't use these other terms if we're also just kind of using them as a means of trying to, affect a political end, just as a kind of a use of rhetorical power rather than an attempt to actually name something real and then to use that term as something real, regardless of the topic and regardless of how it might turn out for our political side or our political issue or something. So so I guess my beef wouldn't be with the use of the terms themselves as much as without knowing more about the context, I guess, to say what's actually behind the use of the terms. If it's authentic, if it's consistent, let's do it. If it's an attempt to divide and to use power and to contribute to throwaway culture, then let's do better.
Great, thanks. Our last question comes from Sister Mercedes, who is a Mercedarian sister who's doing some of her theological formation with us. And she says, Dr. Camosy, when you mentioned facilitating real dating and genuine encounters, I immediately thought of Catholic Gators, which I imagine is a campus ministry in Florida, where tons of religious vocations and marriages have come from. How do you see fostering a relationship with God as a way of rebuilding our culture and encountering others with dignity and respect?
I think that also comes directly into contact with the point about being quiet, right? And quieting ourselves and our minds and our hearts and allowing God to speak to us in a particular way, and not just for like, what kind of decision we'll make about a relatively unimportant matter, but about our vocations. Like what is God calling us to in our very natures and selves? And I'm glad Sister brought this up and mentioned religious vocations as well as marriages, because I think that's a big, I also saw a tweet recently from Elizabeth Brunig, which said, give your money to the sisters, right? I think that there's so much good being done by people who've been called to religious vocations now on every single life issue you can imagine and every social justice issue you can imagine. That we really need. It's not just dating and leading to marriage that's important. It's about hearing God's call there as well, and it's God's call in every context that we're talking about, whether we're talking about a vocation that involves marriage or something else. We're talking about a religious call. Yes, making room for God's voice is maybe the primary thing we ought to be thinking about.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Charlie. And with that, I want to extend a giant virtual thank you and applause to you for spending your evening with us. We do have a second lecture with Dr. Camosy tomorrow morning if you've registered for it. And you can still have time to register for it if you'd like, and in which he will be talking about secularized medicine and the effect that it has on human equality, human dignity. So we look forward to his remarks there. That'll start at 9 a.m. Central Time. Once again, please fill out the survey if you are able, and we hope to see many of you tomorrow morning. Thanks for joining us.